All right, so James is going to start with where our scripture memory verse starts. After the verse 1, the greeting, he's going to go into this actually, let's just say it again. Consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith produces perseverance. All right, so he's going to start with this idea of trials. All right, so this week I asked on Facebook, when have you walked through struggles or trials, or, and I mentioned I was going to preach on this passage of scripture, and, how have you experienced the reality of this? And here were some of the responses. Joy in trials, question mark. Another one, this is a tough prayer for us weak people. And another one said, I struggle with this verse. Is a child's cancer a trial of faith, a crippling car accident, a God test of our faith? This is not how I see God, so this verse doesn't make sense to me. All right, so let's unpack this for just a little bit. And we want to talk a little bit about God's role in these trials, these temptations, these testings that happen in our lives. So as we think about this, let me just remind you of what we teach a lot around here and what's really clear in this passage of scripture. This passage doesn't say that God is sending you trials. It doesn't say that God is testing you. It doesn't say that God is causing these temptations to come to you. In fact, the text really implies just the opposite. God isn't doing this to you, but this is something that happens in the course of life. We are all going to experience trials in our lives. You will, I will, some of you are walking through trials right now. This is a part of life. And those trials, there's a variety of things I think of when I think of trials and tribulations. I think of people that I've had a chance to minister to just in the last couple of weeks, people I've talked with, I've prayed with. And I think of a man who fell off a ladder and broke his ribs and fractured his neck. It wasn't what he planned to do. Do we think that God knocked the ladder over so he fell over and broke his ribs and fractured his neck? No, of course not. That's just part of what happens sometimes in life, right? Or I think about a man who's living homeless in his car that I spent time with the other day. And, was it God who wanted him to live homeless in his car, or a set of circumstances in his life that led, into this place, and then now looking for people who are going to come alongside and help him? Or a family I visited with who lost their son to suicide. Was that God's idea? Or is it part of what happens in life? And so what I've tried to teach you many times is God isn't in the business of giving his children cancer or causing them to fall, or a young woman this week I spoke to whose beloved dog, has cancer and it's not treatable. Right? And all of those things, is God in the business of giving dogs cancer or causing, young people to choose to take their own lives? No, this is not what God does. And so this verse is not saying God has done all these terrible trials to you so that, the testing of your faith will produce endurance or perseverance. This verse is saying that there are times when these things happen and God can take these things and bring about something good and beautiful out of the pain. That's what the scripture is promising. And it's a piece of wisdom literature. And wisdom is something that we learn over experience over time. So we learn it because we've experienced this in our own lives. That's what this is saying. I'm reminding you, and I'd like to remind you of a quote that I shared with you. I've shared it probably 5 or 6 times in sermons over the last 32 years. It was something that was shared with me when we were early in the church's ministry. There was a retired pastor who came alongside after he retired to work here at Resurrection. He gave his time to be a part of helping this place happen. And it was a quote that he shared with me. This is a picture of that retired pastor, Ray Firestone, and this is me. And that was my 40th birthday, and it was his 80th birthday, and we were preaching. Each of us preached half the sermon that day. That's 17 years ago, and Ray passed away some time ago, about 10 years ago, I think. And and those of you at the Leawood location know of the Firestone Chapel, named after Ray Firestone. So Ray had lost his wife it's actually 50 years ago this week. 50 years ago this last Thursday, Ray lost his wife. He had 3 children. The oldest was 12 years old. He was a pastor, a librarian, I think at Baker University at the time. And his wife was parked in front of a railroad crossing. The arms were down, I think, and parked there. And there was someone who wasn't noticing and ran into the back of her car, and she was pushed in front of the train as the train was coming, and she was killed. And so, Ray, a pastor, is trying to make sense of this and trying to put together, how do I live? How do I go forward? How am I going to do this? And all the grief and the pain and the fear and the anxiety, all of those things. And there was a quote that helped him through that, and he shared it with me, and I've again shared it with you. This is what it says: suffering is not God's desire for us, but it occurs in the process of life. Suffering is not given to teach us something, but through it we may learn. Suffering is not given to teach others something, but through it they may learn. Suffering is not given to punish us, but sometimes it is the consequence of our sin or poor judgment. Suffering does not occur because our faith is weak, but through it our faith may be strengthened. God does not depend on human suffering to achieve his purposes. But sometimes through suffering, his purposes are achieved. Suffering can either destroy us or it can add meaning to our life. I really appreciate that quote. I might say a few of those little pieces a bit differently here or there, but generally speaking, it makes an important truth known, and that is that God isn't in the business of pushing women's cars in front of the train as the train is coming, causing automobile accidents, or leaving a father to raise 3 children on their own, or leaving kids without their parent, or a whole host of other kinds of trials and pain and suffering that we experience in this world. But instead, God, not sending those things, chooses to redeem them. He chooses to use them to bring something good and beautiful in our lives when we put them in God's hands. And that is why James can tell us to consider it pure joy when we experience trials of any kind. Because what we know, what we choose to believe, as we say around here a lot, is that the worst thing is never the last thing. Frederick Buechner, by the way, Frederick Buechner is the one who quoted that, or who wrote that statement to begin with, and I quote him a lot. He passed away just a few weeks ago. But this idea that whatever happens in our lives, the pain and suffering doesn't come from God, but God is not going to allow it to be wasted in our life is very, very important.